in organizing the series. In our first workshop, we discussed the steps for writing a history paper. We talk about the importance of understanding the prompts. What else did we discuss? Okay, the importance of securing your sources. We talk about how formulating a thesis statement and the basics of formulating a statement and organizing your paper. The second and third workshops we dedicated to getting you acquainted with the resources you have at hand at FIU to access primary and secondary sources you need to write your papers. Today, we have our last workshop dedicated to discuss what to look for before sending a new paper. What to look for before you hit submit. And we thank and welcome Dr. Gray, who is going to lead today's session. But a final note before leaving you with Dr. Gray. I really appreciate everybody's participation in these workshops. I hope we have given you important tools, not only to succeed in your history classes this term, but also writing across disciplines in your academic performance and beyond in your professional development. So thank you again for your attendance, and I leave you with Dr. Gray.
Alrighty, thanks Dr. Londoño, who has organized all of this, so mad props to her for being on all of this and making sure we all made this happen. I'm going to share my screen here for a minute, and then we can all look together. Fantastic. So I'm going to, let me see if I can share the screen a little more easily. All right, so here we are, the little details that make a huge difference. These are the things that you all are going to want to do to make that paper go from like B plus A minus to like bam. Really making an impression on your professor. So today we're going to first talk about how you fix your footnotes. One of the things we see most often with folks coming into our tutors are struggling with the citations and the footnotes. We're going to talk about when to use historical words to describe people and when to use modern words to describe people. This is very tricky. When we are listening to our sources, sometimes it's hard to know what the right thing to say is, and we'll talk about that. And finally, the thing that a lot of people worry about is how do you sound formal while still sounding like yourself? And that's going to be where we end up with. So first of all, let's look at some common mistakes that people make with their footnotes. One thing I see a lot is when your footnote goes to a number in your bibliography rather than going in numerical order throughout your paper, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down. Usually, I find that this happens when someone doesn't quite understand how Chicago style works. So each citation that you do gets a new footnote, right? Even if you've already used the source, you still are going to give it a new footnote. So your paper, if you have 9 footnotes in your paper, they're going to go 1 through 9, lowest to highest. So you're not going to go 1, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1 through 9 all the way through. Another thing I often will see is that sometimes people just have 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 all the way through the paper. Usually when that happens, that's Microsoft Word. So in order to fix this problem, let me unshare my screen and I can show you. Let's see, stop and share a minute, and then I'll pull up Microsoft Word and we'll share from there. Screen here, Microsoft. Where's my Word? Let's try this again. All right, guys, thanks for bearing with us with all the tech today. There it is. All right. So here, what you will normally do is go to references and insert footnote. If it's not right, then we can come over here to, no. Do I have to make it big? It's being impatient. All right. Okay, let's try this. All right. Shoot, it's not working today. Well, there is a way to actually change the layout on the formatting on your thing. I used to be able to do it. I am not going to be able to do it today. Control click. It's also hard because I have the Zoom bar literally in the wrong spot, which does not. There we go. Well, regardless. Sorry about that, guys. Stop share. All right, let's come back to the PowerPoint. So you will be able to fix it in Microsoft Word if that's the problem that you are having. In Chicago style, there are a few things you do not need to worry about. You do not need to worry about a DOI, a date accessed, and you may or may not worry about your ISBN. It's not mandatory to have an ISBN in your citation. You may decide to have one depending on what you're doing. But so if you're trying to include one of these three things, odds are high you're not doing a full correct interpretation of Chicago. One thing I want to make sure that everyone is clear on is you will never use parentheses, right? With Chicago, you're only using footnotes. One thing I see sometimes is the students still put the parentheses and then put a footnote marker at the end of the parenthetical citation. You can just get rid of the parentheses, only the footnote, and then of course a reference page at the end if you're using more than one source. In Chicago style, sometimes you need a full citation and sometimes you don't, and this is where a lot of folks get confused. The first time you cite a source, you can cite it completely, right? Author, title, place of publication, publisher, date, and page number. When you cite it again, all you need is the author's last name, a short version of that title, and the page number. So that makes it a little bit easier on you every time after the first time. If you Google Chicago Manual of Style, you will often come up with things to tell you to use IBID if you are citing the same source twice in a row. So for example, the first footnote, Smith's citing is Fund 33, and then if you cite that exact page again, IBID. My experience though is that this gets confusing, especially if you split it between the end of two pages, right? So if at the bottom, your last footnote on one page is Smith citing his Fund 33, and then the first footnote on the next page is IBID. Well, then someone has to flip back to see what your IBID is, right? And so if you have several of these in a row, we lose track and we have to scan back anyway. Long story short, IBID is what they used to do when you actually manually put footnotes at the bottom of a page on like a typewriter. It saved you a little bit of hassle. Now we have word processors, it doesn't take us nearly as much time. So it's less of an issue. So I would recommend, and I believe this is the current Chicago Manual of Style recommendation, is to use that abbreviated citation like I showed you. If your professor, for some reason, would like you to use IBID, of course, you listen to them instead of me. They're the one giving you the grade. So now, let's switch gears and look at some terminology. This gets tricky, right? Because when we're looking at sources, we want to talk about things the way that people in the past did, right? We're trying to learn from them. This is part of how our field works. We are learning from people in the past as accurately as possible. But we have definitely evolved in how we talk about people, right? Especially racial or social categories, right? These terms might be accurate to the time that you're writing, but they don't match our values as authors and scholars. So it's also hard to tell when words have changed their meaning over time, because these might have been words that were acceptable in the past, but we don't use them now. So how do you know? The best recommendation I have is to be a critical thinker about the descriptors in your source, right? And this is where you look at exactly how a word is being used, right? Are in question specific slang or stereotype for an ethnic or racial minority. That's the first place I start, is are they using this to talk about a group of people? Then, do we have a different, less stereotyped word now? If you are not sure what a word means, please Google it. If you don't know what a word means, you definitely should not use it to describe a person. That is how you get yourself in some trouble. In quotes, it is different, right? Especially if this kind of derogatory language is central to your argument, you have to quote something directly that is faithful to the source that you are using. But don't use those terms elsewhere in your paper for flavor or just because it's historical, right? Keep those words into the quotes where they would originate. If we have outdated words that are present in your sources as like a category or a technical term, right? Some examples I see a lot with old documents are Negro, which used to be the correct way to describe Black Americans. Indian used to be the only way that people describe Native Americans, right? So if you see them on census records, they will be listed like that, which means that you have to use those words when you're talking about your categories. But make sure that you define your terms at the beginning so that they are part of your analysis and not your own words. That's, in my experience, those are the places where I see people tripping up the most. TLDR, we're here to talk about ideas and people. Where we have to use outdated language to discuss those ideas, we can approach it mindfully and carefully as part of being historians. But where those language and words can be construed as our words, or where it's more of like a flavor, then we need to use the language that we consider respectful in our time and place. I see fewer of these issues over the years, but the number of times I have seen variations on racial slurs in papers when we're talking about racial and ethnic minorities, we want to not do that. Finally, and I know I'm breezing through this really quickly, I want to give you all a chance to ask questions about things that are concerning you, since there are relatively few of us. Actually, let me take a pause a second. All right. So, one thing that a lot of people worry about is that they lose their own voice when they try to write professionally, right? The idea that professional writing is kind of a cookie cutter is, in my experience, actually very false. Good professional writing leaves your voice, your personality, your way of expressing yourself intact, and then removes some casual markers of speech from the text. Right? If I put on my best clothes and makeup for a job interview, I'm still me, right? And so for the same perspective, putting formal touches on your paper should not actually change the way that you talk. Just present yourself at your best so people are focusing on the content and are not really being distracted by any surface level errors you might be making. What that leads to is that there are some really quick, easy things that you can almost like Control F, search your paper, right? The first of them is I statements. These are the fastest thing to fix because you just look for any time you use the word I in your paper. Write something like, I believe that Japanese internment was a human rights abuse rather than military necessity. Why should we not use this? Well, of course you believe it. It's your paper. I should hope you believe it because you're writing it. So we can infer that you believe it and just remove the I statement and leave everything else intact. Then we get something that's nice and short and punchy. Japanese internment was a human rights abuse rather than a military necessity. Bam. Fewer words, which gives you more space to talk about something else. And it sounds automatically more confident and more professional just because you took that I believe out of there. I'll admit one of my biggest pet peeves is rhetorical questions, right? Because usually you're either asking a question that you're about to answer, in which case, why are you asking it? Or you're asking a question that you don't mean to answer, you're just provoking thought. That's not inherently wrong, but it doesn't necessarily work well in an academic paper. In an academic paper, your job as a writer is to answer questions rather than to ask them. In other genres of writing, this can help you transition between ideas, or it can help you provoke thought. not in this genre. Just remove the question on my experience, right? Odds are high that that sentence afterwards is the point you really did want to make, and you were just trying to transition to it, right? So in my example, but what really caused the Civil War? Although some claimed it was over states' rights, the Civil War was a war over slavery. So if we just take out that question, we are left with, although some claimed it was over states' rights, the Civil War was a war over slavery. Here we are. Once again, we're left with this nice, quick, punchy sentence that tells us just as much as we knew already. This is an area where I see a lot of folks make some mistakes, especially when they're not secure in their own writing, right? You all are, I promise, smart. You're in a college class, first of all, and you're writing a paper at the end of the semester. I promise you know what you're talking about. So there are some ways that you can show the audience that you know what you're talking about and kind of project the confidence that I would hope you have about the conclusions that you're drawing. First off, we have conditional language. These are the things that are like maybes. Maybe, perhaps, could, right? This letter could be evidence of. Well, is it? I hope so, right? You're using it, right? So instead, we can go, this letter is evidence of, right? Let's stand by our assertions, right? Similar here, right? Such an argument perhaps indicates, well, you're using this argument in a particular way. Let's stand by it, right? Let's just put your argument out there. It's okay. It's okay to say this argument indicates. Yes, it does. You are telling me this. You are convincing me of this. This is the next one, right? Over elevating or over complicating your prose. So when we write, we often have an idea in our minds about what we think smart sounds like. And because we are all our own defaults, we think about what does something smarter than us sound like, and we try and imitate that. The problem is when we get to this lovely level in college, where we are actually smart, then that means we're actually end up confusing people. When we try and sound quote unquote smarter than ourselves, it ends up being more confusing than it needs to be. So whenever I see that marker of people trying to sound too smart or trying to make their words and sentences complicated, that's usually a sign for me that the writer is insecure. And I see that at all levels. I see that at intro, I've seen it with graduate students, I've seen it with professionals. It is one of the most surefire signs that you don't necessarily believe what you're talking about. But I can assure you, right, if your argument is solid and your writing is clear, you've succeeded, right? Write it the way that you think it, then go through and make all of these other fixes, right? Remove your I statements, remove your rhetorical questions, remove your maybes, and keep it the way that you got it. That's okay. One of my favorite pieces of advice to give to people, and this is actually how I did my dissertation defense, so it works at all levels. Imagine what you would need in order for your grandparents to understand you. Because your grandparents are wonderfully intelligent, world-wise people who understand a lot of different things. They may not know your exact topic, but they know how the world works. So what do they need to know in order to understand what you are saying? And that is the level of clarity you should write for. Imagine your grandparents are reading it. It has yet to steer me wrong. Whenever I'm writing, I think about what my grandparents need. For formality, right? The biggest thing, cardinal sin, is the use of the word you, right? Never, ever, ever. We do not use you in an academic paper. If we use it, that usually means we're speaking too directly to an imagined audience, right? You might think that the sky is blue, but I'm here to tell you that it is green. Well, that might not actually be your actual audience. You might not know, right? Does your audience think that the sky is blue? You don't know that, right? So it's kind of imagining something that's not there, and it's a little too direct for formal writing, just one of those funny arbitrary rules that English has. I find the best way to fix that is to rephrase your point a little to get at your root idea, right? So it's easy to imagine X, or a common perception is Y. So if you just change your phrasing a little bit, you can get around that U and formalize it immediately. Contractions are another thing that we just can get rid of quickly, right? It's becomes it is. Couldn't because comes could not. It adds more words to your word count, but it is more formal and will read kind of more professionally to your audience. Numbers, right? Your year will stay as a number. 1800 stays as 1800. But other numbers, 1, 2, 3, 20, 30, these you would all spell out as words rather than putting them as the number 1, the number 2, right? 30 is 30. Just the words are what you're going to want there. Again, it reads more professionally. And that takes you about 30 seconds, right? When you're going through to edit your paper, right? You just scan for any numbers that you've used and put a word there. It really doesn't take too long, and that's what we want, right? We don't want your grammar editing to take longer than the rest of your paper, right? Just quick things to make a difference for you. Thank you all for bearing with me as I sped through it. I wanted to give us ample time to ask questions. If you all are in Zoom, you're welcome to either unmute yourself or to type a question in the chat. We also have some folks in the room if anyone would like to ask questions as well.
While everyone's taking some time to gather their thoughts, I also have an additional advice as well. When you're writing your paper, remember to organize your paragraphs around your ideas, not about single pieces of evidence. It's okay to have multiple pieces of evidence in one single paragraph. Otherwise, if you organize each paragraph around one piece of evidence, so if you're arguing, let's say, about the effectiveness of the New Deal, so your first paper is about Herbert Hoover's criticism of the New Deal, your second paragraph's about the CCC, and your third paragraph's about FDR's support of the New Deal, that's sounding like a summary of your evidence and not your own argument. Rather, think about your paper as an argument. If you think it's going to be effective, how is it effective? What are the multiple pieces of evidence that support each specific argument? Something I've noticed a lot lately, so something to keep in mind. You're arguing, you're presenting your argument, not a summary of evidence.
Thank you, Dr. Brian and Dr. Gray. It doesn't matter. It is not about particular presentation Dr. Gray did just now. If you have any question regarding the writing of your papers, it is time to formulate those questions right now. We welcome your questions and we'll do the best for answering those.
All right, thank you all for joining us. It was a little shorter than necessarily scheduled. I did want to allow time for questions if it was there. You all are free to go whenever or hang out and ask questions.